On a Tuesday morning in March, my husband sat across from me at our kitchen table, slid a folded piece of paper toward me, and asked how soon I could be out. He'd been sleeping with my best friend of 19 years for close to a year. And somehow, in his mind, the house we lived in belonged to both of them now. It didn't. Daniel didn't know that. Kelsey didn't know it either. And I hadn't corrected them because I hadn't needed to yet. That morning, I remember the coffee maker was still gurgling. I remember there was a smear of grape jelly on the paper he slid over because our daughter had used the same table for breakfast 20 minutes earlier. I remember thinking, calmly, almost clinically, he actually believes this is going to be easy. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at the paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a list, in his handwriting, of next steps, movers, a timeline, a number he thought was fair for me to walk away with. He'd clearly rehearsed this. What he hadn't done, in 11 years of marriage, was ask to see the deed to the house we lived in. I want you to hold on to that detail. It matters later. To understand why that Tuesday went the way it did, you have to go back almost 14 years, to a version of me that had just buried her father and didn't know what to do with a life insurance check for $211,000. My name is Meredith. I was 29. I worked as a staff accountant at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of job where you learn early that paperwork is never boring, it's just underestimated. My father had died of a heart attack in his sleep on a Sunday and left me the kind of money that changes what's possible without changing who you are. My father had one piece of advice he repeated so often it became a kind of family joke. Buy something with your name on it before you put anyone else's name on anything. He didn't trust marriages to hold, not because he was bitter, but because he'd watched two of his brothers lose everything in divorces where they'd commingled every asset they had. He wanted better for me. So 8 months after the funeral, I used that money as a down payment on a 3-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane, in a quiet subdivision outside Concord. I financed the rest through my own credit, under my own name, and closed on it alone, sitting in a title company office signing papers with a pen that ran out of ink halfway through. I wasn't married yet. I wasn't even dating anyone seriously. The house was mine on paper, in the most literal sense. The deed said Meredith and Sinclair, one name, no one else's. 2 years later, I met Daniel. Daniel Cole sold commercial insurance and had the kind of easy charm that made rooms feel warmer when you walked into them. We met at a mutual friend's cookout, and within 6 months we were serious. He moved into the Birchwood house with me before we married. That part felt practical at the time. Rent was wasted money, he said, and I already owned a perfectly good house, so why pay for two? I remember, about 4 months into dating, sitting on the back steps one evening when he asked, half joking, whether I'd ever add his name to things, once we got serious. I told him honestly that I hadn't thought about it. The truth is I had thought about it, briefly and quietly, the way you think about a decision you've already made without announcing it, and I decided the house would stay exactly the way my father had told me to keep it. Not because I distrusted Daniel specifically, just because it was already done, and there was no urgent reason to undo it. He never brought it up again. Not once in 11 years. I used to think that meant it simply didn't matter to him. Looking back, I think it meant the opposite, that somewhere along the way he'd quietly decided it didn't need to be formal because he assumed time and marriage would functionally make it his anyway. Assumption is a strange kind of theft. It doesn't feel like taking anything, right up until someone tells you it was never yours to begin with. We got married 18 months later in my aunt's backyard, under a rented arch that kept tilting sideways every time someone opened the side gate. My best friend, Kelsey Marsh, was my maid of honor. She gave a toast that made half the guests cry, including me, about how she'd never seen two people fit together the way Daniel and I did. I still have the framed photo from that toast on a shelf in my office. I haven't taken it down. I don't see the point in pretending the day didn't happen the way it happened. Kelsey and I had been best friends since 7th grade. She was there when my father died. She was there when I miscarried our first pregnancy, sitting on my bathroom floor with me at 2 a.m, saying nothing, just staying. When our daughter, Wren, was born 4 years into the marriage, Kelsey was the first person I called after Daniel. She became Wren's godmother. She had a key to our house, one she'd use to let herself in and start a pot of coffee if she got there before I was up. I tell you all of this not because it's sentimental filler, but because it explains something important. Nobody in my life had more access, more trust, or more history with me than Kelsey did. Which is exactly why it worked. There was a Thanksgiving, 3 years before that Tuesday morning, that I didn't think much of at the time. Daniel's mother, Carol, pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was drying dishes and said, in that careful way mothers-in-law say things they don't want to be blamed for later, "You know Kelsey adores Daniel, right? Always has. Since your wedding, even." I laughed it off. I told her Kelsey adored everybody, that it was just her personality, warm and a little much. Carol nodded and let it go, and so did I. I think about that exchange more than almost anything else now. Not because Carol knew something concrete, but because she'd noticed something I was too close to see. Mothers notice what wives are too busy loving someone to notice. The first crack, if I'm honest, showed up almost 2 years before that Tuesday morning at the kitchen table. Small things. Daniel started going to a new gym, one across town instead of the one 10 minutes from the house. He started keeping his phone face down, which he'd never done before. Not out of suspicion on my part, just noticing, the way accountants notice when a number that's usually round suddenly isn't. Kelsey started coming around more, which didn't seem strange at first. She'd gone through a divorce of her own the year before and leaned on us, on me I assumed, more than usual. She'd stop by on weeknights, just to say hi, and end up staying for dinner. Daniel would walk her out to her car. Sometimes that walk took longer than it should have. I noticed. I filed it away. I didn't confront anything yet, because I didn't have anything to confront, just a feeling, and feelings without evidence have never been useful to me in any part of my life, professional or personal. Then, in October, I found a receipt. It was tucked into the console of Daniel's car, from a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city, dated a Tuesday afternoon when he told me he was at a client lunch in Salisbury. 2 coffees, 1 room. Checkout at 3:40 p.m. I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes with that receipt in my lap before I went inside. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him that night. What I did instead was open a folder, an actual manila folder, the kind I use for client files at work, and I put that receipt inside it. Then I started paying closer attention, the way you do when you finally understand what you're looking for. Over the next few months, I collected more than I ever wanted to. A calendar invite on our shared family calendar, titled Only Errands, that matched the same hotel's location when I checked the map's history on the shared iPad. A lipstick shade in Daniel's car that wasn't the drugstore brand Kelsey usually wore in front of me, but was, I'd later learn, her going-out shade. A string of nights he said he was golfing that didn't line up with the golf course's own posted tea time closures for maintenance. None of it was dramatic. All of it was documentation. That's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It rarely announces itself. It leaves a paper trail, the same way everything else in life does if you know to look. There was one moment, in November, that almost broke my composure entirely. I ran into Kelsey at the grocery store on a Sunday afternoon, both of us pushing carts, and she asked, completely normally, how Daniel and I were doing, whether we had any big plans for the holidays. I remember standing in the cereal aisle answering her, something ordinary, something about maybe going to the coast for a few days, while she nodded along, warm as ever, her cart half full of things I recognized, things I knew she cooked when she had someone over for dinner. I didn't know yet, not with certainty, that some of those dinners were with my husband. I only knew, standing there, that something about the conversation felt like static on a radio station that used to come and clean. I went home and added the date to my folder with a single word next to it, Kroger. I didn't know yet what it would end up meaning. I just knew, by then, to write everything down. A friend of mine from the accounting firm, Denise, mentioned something to me in early December that finally moved things from suspicion to near certainty. She'd seen Daniel's car parked outside a coffee shop downtown on a Wednesday morning, at a table by the window with Kelsey, their heads close together over something on the table. She hadn't thought much of it in the moment, she said. Daniel and Kelsey had known each other 20 years after all, but she mentioned it in passing because Kelsey had reached over and touched his hand in a way, Denise said, that wasn't really a friend thing. I thanked her. I didn't tell her why it mattered as much as it did. I added the date to the folder. I also did something else that fall, something Daniel never knew about until much later. I called a real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Hale who'd handled a few things for my firm's clients over the years, and I asked her a single question. If my husband and I ever divorced, would the house on Birchwood Lane be considered marital property? She asked for the closing documents. I sent them over that same week. The deed, the original mortgage, the settlement statement from the sale, all of it still under one name. Mine. Patricia called me back 4 days later and told me what I already suspected but needed confirmed, because I'd purchased the house before the marriage with separate funds and had never added Daniel to the deed or refinanced under both our names. It remained my separate property under North Carolina law. Daniel had lived there. Daniel had, at times, contributed to a shared account that covered some bills. None of that changed whose name was on the title. I remember writing the date in my planner that day, November 14th, with no explanation next to it, just the date in Patricia's name. I wasn't planning revenge. I want to be honest about that. I was planning information. There's a difference, and it matters. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, life kept happening the way it stubbornly does. In December, I was offered a promotion at the firm, senior manager, a title I'd been quietly working toward for 3 years, one that came with a modest raise in my own small office with a door that closed. I remember sitting in my new office on my first Monday, looking at the nameplate someone had ordered for my desk, thinking that I had built at least one thing in my life that nobody could quietly assume half of. I hadn't told anyone at work what was happening at home. I didn't need pity. I needed the work, honestly, because it was the one place where effort still produced exactly the outcome it was supposed to. By January, the affair had stopped being subtle, at least to anyone paying close attention. Kelsey started posting things, vague, aspirational things, about new beginnings and choosing yourself, the kind of captions that mean nothing to strangers and everything to the 2 or 3 people who know exactly what they're about. Mutual friends started acting strange around me at a birthday party in February. Not cruel, just careful. The kind of careful people get when they know something you don't, or think you don't. I kept my folder updated. I kept going to work. I kept making Ren's lunches and going to her soccer games and sleeping, most nights, next to a man I now understood was living a second life in the same house as the folder documenting it. People ask me sometimes why I didn't confront him the moment I found the receipt. The honest answer is that I wanted to understand the whole shape of it before I said a single word, because the moment you speak, the other person adjusts their behavior. I'd learned that from 12 years of doing forensic-adjacent work in accounting. You don't tip your hand until you have the full picture. You gather quietly. You confront once, and you confront with everything. Which brings us back to that Tuesday morning in March, and the folded piece of paper with grape jelly on the corner. Daniel had decided, apparently over a long weekend trip he told me was for work in Raleigh, that he was done. He sat across from me and told me, calmly, like he was reading off a script he'd practiced in his car, that he and Kelsey were finally being honest with themselves, that he hadn't been happy in a long time, and that he thought, given everything, the fairest thing would be for us to sell the house, split the proceeds, and both start fresh. He used the word, our house 4 times in that conversation. I counted. I didn't argue with him. I didn't cry, though I want to be honest and say some part of me wanted to. I asked him one question. When do you and Kelsey want to move in here? He blinked. He hadn't expected that question, because it wasn't the question of a woman about to fight him on the house. It sounded to him like agreement. I mean, not right away, he said. But eventually, yeah. It makes sense. It's a good school district for Ren and... Okay, I said. Let me think about the timeline. I already knew what the timeline was. I just wasn't ready to tell him yet. Here's something I think is worth pausing on. If you're the kind of person who's ever been blindsided by someone you trusted completely, betrayal rarely arrives as a single event. It arrives as a slow accumulation of small permissions someone gives themselves, one at a time, until the big one doesn't feel big to them anymore. Daniel didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy our marriage. He made 100 small decisions over 2 years that made the 101st one, telling me he wanted our house, feel to him, completely reasonable. That's usually how it works. Not a lightning strike, a slow leak. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, the quiet ones, where someone gets underestimated and it costs the wrong person everything, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what happens over the next few weeks in this story is the part almost nobody sees coming, and I don't want you to miss it. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel moved forward, as though the house question were already settled. He told his mother. He told 2 of our mutual friends. Kelsey, I later learned, had already started sending herself paint swatches for what she planned to do with the guest room. My guest room, the one where my father's old armchair still sat by the window. I let all of it happen. I didn't correct anyone. I went to Patricia Hale's office instead, on a Thursday afternoon, and asked her to draft 2 things. A formal letter on firm letterhead, confirming sole ownership of the property and citing the relevant statute, and a written notice, not unfriendly, not cruel, simply factual, informing Daniel that as the sole titled owner, I would require any resident of the home to either be on a lease with my consent or to vacate within 30 days, per state law, if our marital status changed. Patricia asked me if I wanted to soften the language. I told her no. I wanted it to read exactly like what it was, a fact, delivered plainly, the same way you deliver an audit result to a client who didn't like the numbers but couldn't argue with them. I remember signing that letter on a Thursday in early April. I remember it was raining, and Wren had left a drawing on the attorney's waiting room table, a stick-figure family in front of a square house, 3 people and a dog we didn't have, and I sat with that drawing in my lap for a minute before I handed it back to the receptionist to give to my daughter. The certified letter arrived at the house on a Monday, addressed to Daniel. I was in the kitchen when he opened it. I watched his face change 3 separate times, confusion, then something like a laugh, like he thought it was a joke or a mistake, then something much quieter that didn't have a name yet. "What is this?" he said. Not really a question. "It's the deed," I said, "and a letter from my attorney. You can read the whole thing, but the short version is that the house was never ours. It's mine. It was mine before we met. That's not. We've lived here for 11 years, Meredith. That has to count for something." "It does," I said. "It counts as 11 years. You lived somewhere without ever once asking whose name was on the mortgage." He got quiet after that. Then, almost predictably, he tried a different approach. "Even if that's technically true," he said, "you know I'll fight this. 11 years is 11 years, Meredith. A judge isn't going to just let you keep the house and cut me out completely." "You can absolutely talk to your own attorney," I said. "That's your right. But I'd ask them about something called separate property before you get too far into a strategy. Patricia already has the closing documents, the mortgage history, and 11 years of statements showing the payments came from my account. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you what she told me, which is that this isn't really a gray area. So that's it. 11 years, and I walk away with nothing. You walk away with your retirement account, your car, half of everything we actually built together," I said. "You don't walk away with a house you never once asked whose name was on." I want to say there was some cinematic reckoning at the kitchen table after that, some moment where he apologized and meant it. There wasn't. What happened is he went quiet, picked up his phone, and walked into the other room. I heard him through the wall, his voice low and fast, saying Kelsey's name over and over, saying, "I don't understand," more than once, like a man discovering, for the first time, that the ground he'd been standing on had never technically been his. Kelsey called me 20 minutes later. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail, and I listened to it exactly once, standing at the kitchen counter with Wren spelling homework spread out in front of me. Kelsey's voice cracked halfway through. She said she never meant for it to be like this. She didn't specify which part, the affair, or the part where she'd apparently been planning what color to paint a bedroom in a house that was never going to be hers. Here's the part one thing people find most satisfying, though I want to be careful with that word, because there was nothing satisfying about the 2 years leading up to it. Once the truth of the house became public, and it did quickly, the way anything does in a town where everyone shares for social circles, the story around Daniel and Kelsey changed shape. It's one thing to leave your wife of 11 years for her best friend. People judge that, but people also, unfairly or not, sometimes romanticize it, the idea that love found its way through complicated circumstances. It's an entirely different thing to leave your wife for her best friend and then discover you have nowhere to live because you assumed a house was half yours and it never was. Daniel moved into a 1-bedroom apartment off Highway 49 in May. Kelsey, from what I understand through people who still talk to me, had told several mutual friends that she and Daniel were about to buy a beautiful family home together, meaning mine, and had to quietly walk that back once the truth came out. The embarrassment of that walk back did more damage to her friendships than the affair itself had. People don't mind being lied to as much as they mind being made to look foolish for repeating the lie to others. I never sued anyone. I never keyed a car or posted anything online. The consequence wasn't something I did to them. It was something they built for themselves, out of assumptions nobody had bothered to verify, the same way you build a house on land you never checked the title on. Kelsey showed up at the house once, uninvited, about 3 weeks after the letter arrived. I opened the door, and she was standing on the porch in the rain without an umbrella, mascara doing exactly what mascara does in weather like that. She asked if we could talk. I told her we could talk on the porch because she wasn't coming inside a house she'd apparently already picked curtains for. I didn't know it was only in your name, she said. I swear to you, Meredith, I didn't know that. I believe you. I told her and I meant it. But I don't think that changes what you did. You didn't sleep with my husband because you thought you'd get a house out of it. You did it because you wanted him, and you decided that mattered more than 19 years of knowing me. She didn't have an answer for that. She stood there a moment longer, then said she was sorry, and I told her I believed that too, and that it didn't change anything either. She left. That was the last real conversation we ever had. Word travels fast in a town where 4 social circles overlap the way ours did. By June, Kelsey had been quietly uninvited from the book club she'd hosted for 6 years. Nobody said why out loud, but everyone understood why. A baby shower she'd been asked to co-host in the spring suddenly didn't need her help after all. It wasn't organized cruelty. It was just what happens when people who've known you for years watch you do something that makes them recalculate everything else they thought they knew about your character. Wren, who was 9 that spring, didn't fully understand what was happening, and I worked hard to keep it that way. What she understood was that her dad was living somewhere new, that she'd have 2 bedrooms now, 1 at each place, and that her house, the one with her drawings taped to the fridge, the one with her grandfather's armchair by the window, wasn't going anywhere. I think that mattered more than any of the rest of it. Kids don't need every detail of an adult betrayal explained to them. What they need is stability in the one place that's supposed to be unshakable. I could give her that, because 11 years earlier, before I'd even met her father, I'd made one decision that had nothing to do with foresight and everything to do with a piece of advice from a man who wasn't around to see how right he'd been. I think about my dad a lot, actually, in the months after that spring. Not in a sad way. More like, I think he'd have found the whole thing almost funny in that dry way he had. He never met Daniel. He never met Kelsey. But he'd have recognized, immediately, exactly what kind of people they turned out to be, because he'd spent a career watching people make decisions based on what they assumed instead of what they confirmed. By late summer, the divorce was finalized, quieter than I expected, mostly because there wasn't much left to argue about once the house was settled. Daniel kept his 401k, I kept mine. He took the car he'd been making payments on, I kept the one I'd bought outright. Wren split her time between us, which I made peace with, because whatever Daniel had done to me, he'd never once been unkind to her. Kelsey reached out one more time, in September, not by phone this time but by letter, handwritten, 3 pages, an actual apology that named specific things, not just vague regret. I read it twice. I didn't respond. Some bridges you don't burn out of anger. You just stop walking across them because you understand, finally, that the person on the other side was never as solid as you thought they were. I redid the guest room that fall, the one Kelsey had picked paint swatches for without ever asking. I painted it a soft yellow, moved my father's armchair in by the window, and turned it into a reading room for Wren and me. Some Sunday mornings we sit in there together, her with a book, me with coffee, and it doesn't feel like the sight of anything dramatic anymore. It just feels like my house, which on paper and in every other way that matters, it always was. A year later, almost to the week, I stood in that same kitchen taking a photo of Wren on her first day of 5th grade, backpack too big for her, gap-toothed grin, standing by the same door frame we'd measured her height against every August since she could walk. Daniel came by that morning to see her off too. We'd worked out a schedule that let us both be there for things like that, because whatever else had happened, we'd agreed early on that Wren didn't need to inherit our failures as a couple. He stood on the porch, not the kind of ex-husband who lingers too long, and told me the yellow paint in the front window looked nice. I said thank you. That was the whole conversation. It didn't need to be more than that anymore. I think about that Tuesday morning sometimes. The folded paper, the jelly stain, the 4 times Daniel said, our house without ever once having asked whose name was actually on it. I don't think he was a monster. I think he was a man who got comfortable enough in a life he didn't build to assume he had more claim to it than he did. I think Kelsey was a woman who mistook 19 years of friendship for something she was entitled to take a piece of. Neither of them did their homework. I did mine 14 years earlier, in a title company office, signing a deed with a pen that ran out of ink halfway through, because a man I loved told me to put something in my own name before I put anyone else's name next to it. Here's what I've come to believe: if it's worth anything to you, people will often show you exactly who they are through what they assume belongs to them without asking. The apology rarely matters as much as the assumption did in the first place. And the quietest form of protection isn't a lock on a door. It's simply knowing, in writing, what's actually yours before anyone gives you a reason to need to know. So I'll leave you with this. If someone you trusted for nearly 2 decades, a spouse, a best friend, someone who knew every version of you, decided you were something they could quietly help themselves to, would you confront it the moment you suspected it? Or would you do what I did and wait until you had the whole picture, even if it meant living one more season inside a truth only you could see? Where's your line and why?